In a Philadelphia courtroom, where justice meets destiny, a young black teen's simple shoplifting case turns into a moment that leaves everyone stunned. As Judge Sarah Mitchell prepares to deliver her verdict, the boy rises and speaks words that shatter 2 decades of secrets. "I have proof you're my mother." What unfolds next will change both their lives forever. The marble halls of Philadelphia's Central Criminal Court echoed with the usual Monday morning bustle. Lawyers hurried past with briefcases tight in their grips, their shoes clicking against the polished floor as they rushed to their respective courtrooms. Outside, the October wind whipped around the building's imposing columns, carrying the first hints of winter's approach. But in courtroom 4B, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Judge Sarah Mitchell adjusted her robes as she prepared for another day of cases. Her silver-streaked black hair was pulled back in its usual severe bun, not a strand out of place, just like everything else in her meticulously ordered life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At 45, she had earned a reputation as the Iron Lady of the juvenile justice system. Known for her strict sentencing and no-nonsense approach, she had spent 15 years building a career that commanded respect, if not always admiration. Her colleagues whispered that she was too harsh on young offenders, but Sarah believed in consequences, structure, order. These were the principles that had guided her from a troubled past to her position of authority. The morning docket seemed routine, a teenage shoplifting case. Marcus Thompson, age 15, caught stealing headphones from an upscale electronics store in Center City. His dark skin contrasted sharply with the crisp white shirt his public defender had insisted he wear. He sat at the defendant's table, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on his hands, occasionally glancing at the worn backpack at his feet. There was something different about this boy, something in his demeanor that set him apart from the usual parade of troubled teens who passed through her courtroom. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Judge Mitchell reviewed the case file. Her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose, catching the light as she flipped through the pages. The courtroom was unusually full for a juvenile case. Several law students had chosen today to observe, scattered throughout the gallery like birds on a wire. Among them sat an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair, clutching a leather-bound notebook to her chest. She watched Marcus with an intensity that seemed out of place for a simple shoplifting case. Case number 2025 JD 1472, the court clerk announced, his voice carrying through the hushed room. Commonwealth versus Marcus Thompson, charged with retail theft under Pennsylvania Statute 3929A. He shuffled some papers, the sound abnormally loud in the tension-filled room. The defendant has no prior record, Your Honor. Sarah glanced up from her papers, her dark eyes scanning the courtroom with practiced detachment. But something made her pause as her gaze fell on Marcus. There was something familiar in the way he held himself, in the curve of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. A memory tickled at the edges of her consciousness. Something from another lifetime, something she had buried so deep she thought it would never surface. She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. The public defender, James Chen, stood up, straightening his slightly rumpled suit. Your Honor, if I may, my client, Mr. Thompson, she interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of authority she had carefully cultivated over the years. You are charged with theft of merchandise valued at $349.99. How do you plead? Marcus shifted in his chair, his public defender leaning in to whisper something in his ear. The boy's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. Sarah noticed a small scar on his right wrist, shaped like a crescent moon. Her heart skipped a beat, but that was impossible. Pure coincidence. Before I plead, Marcus started, his voice stronger than anyone expected. There's something the court needs to know. His words carried a weight that seemed beyond his 15 years. Judge Mitchell's eyebrow arched slightly, the only sign of her irritation at this departure from procedure. The elderly woman in the gallery leaned forward, her notebook forgotten in her lap. Young man, this is a simple matter. Either you plead guilty or not guilty. There's no need for... I know why you look familiar, Marcus interrupted, standing suddenly. His public defender tugged at his sleeve, trying to get him to sit down, but Marcus remained standing. I've been carrying your picture my whole life. The courtroom fell silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers ceased. Sarah's hand tightened around her gavel, her knuckles turning white. Through the tall windows, clouds passed over the sun, casting shifting shadows across the courtroom floor. Mr. Thompson, I'm warning you. I have proof you're my mother, Marcus declared, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. From his pocket, he pulled out a worn photograph, its edges softened by years of handling. This is you 20 years ago at New Hope Women's Clinic, the same day you gave me up. His voice cracked slightly on the last words. The gavel slipped from Sarah's grasp, clattering against the wooden bench. The sound echoed through the stunned silence like a gunshot. Her carefully constructed world began to tilt on its axis as she stared at the photograph in Marcus's hand. A photograph she thought she had destroyed 2 decades ago. It showed a younger version of herself, tear-stained and broken, standing outside a red brick building on a rainy spring morning. The whispers started then, rippling through the gallery like waves on a pond. Law students traded wide-eyed glances, court officers shifted uncomfortably, and the elderly woman in the gallery clutched her notebook so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sarah's throat went dry, her heart pounding so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. The room seemed to spin as past and present collided in this moment she had spent 20 years trying to prevent. Bailiff, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Clear the courtroom. But it was too late. The secret was out, hanging in the air like smoke, impossible to contain. And in that moment, as Sarah stared into eyes that mirrored her own, she realized that all her carefully constructed walls were about to come crumbling down. 20 years of careful planning, of buried memories and denied truths, all undone by a single photograph and a boy's unwavering gaze. The bailiff's voice boomed through courtroom 4B, instructing everyone to leave, but the spectators seemed frozen in place. The usual shuffle of departing observers was replaced by a thick, expectant silence. Even the ancient radiator in the corner, which had been clanking steadily all morning, seemed to hold its breath. Judge Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her bench, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the worn oak. 20 years of carefully constructed barriers threatened to collapse around her. The photograph in Marcus's hand seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, a tangible piece of the past she had tried so desperately to bury. I said clear the courtroom, she repeated, her voice stronger this time, though it carried an unmistakable tremor. The authority she had wielded so confidently just moments ago now felt like a costume she was wearing, ill-fitting and obvious to everyone watching. The elderly woman in the gallery stood first, but instead of leaving, she moved closer to Marcus. Your Honor, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I'm Margaret Wilson from Child Protective Services. I've been Marcus's caseworker for the past 15 years. She placed a protective hand on Marcus's shoulder, and Sarah noticed how the boy seemed to lean into the touch, drawing strength from it. Sarah's vision blurred slightly. Margaret Wilson. The name hit her like a physical blow. She remembered another Margaret Wilson, 15 years younger, who had handled the adoption paperwork, who had promised her that her secret would be safe, that her child would find a good home. Mrs. Wilson? Sarah managed, fighting to keep her voice steady. This is highly irregular. This case is about a simple retail theft, nothing more. But even as she spoke the words, she knew it was useless. The carefully constructed walls of her life were already crumbling. Marcus still stood, the photograph extended in his slightly trembling hand. I found this in my file at the group home, he said, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and hurt that made Sarah's chest tighten. Along with my original birth certificate, the one that hasn't been redacted. The public defender, James Chen, looked between his client and the judge, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. Your Honor, I had no knowledge of this development. Perhaps we should recess to discuss. There's nothing to discuss, Sarah cut him off, but her words lacked conviction. Her eyes remained fixed on the photograph. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She could almost smell the rain from that day, feel the weight of her parents' disappointment, the crushing fear of a future derailed. She had been barely 18, a freshman in college with dreams of law school. Her family had made it clear, either give up the baby or give up their support. There had seemed to be no choice at all. Marcus took a step forward, ignoring his lawyer's attempt to hold him back. "I spent 15 years in 7 different foster homes," he said, each word deliberate and heavy with emotion. "I watched other kids get adopted, get chosen, while I stayed behind. And all this time, you were here, less than 20 miles away, wearing that robe, passing judgment on other kids like me." The words struck Sarah like physical blows. She had told herself the adoption would give him a better life, that somewhere he was happy with a family who could provide everything she couldn't. The reality he described shattered that comforting fiction. "I never—" She started, then stopped, unsure what she could possibly say to justify her choices. The courtroom doors burst open, and Sarah's clerk, David, rushed in. "Your Honor, the press is gathering outside. Someone must have texted about what's happening. They're asking for a statement." The news hit Sarah like a bucket of cold water. Of course, in today's world, nothing stayed contained. Her private shame was about to become public spectacle. Her colleagues, her friends, the legal community she had worked so hard to impress, everyone would know. "This session is adjourned," she announced, standing abruptly. "Bailiff, please escort everyone out through the back entrance," and she turned to retreat to her chambers, her sanctuary. "You can't run away from me again." Marcus's voice cracked with emotion. "Not this time." Sarah froze, her hand on the door to her chambers. The word again echoed in her mind, though Marcus couldn't possibly remember the first time she had walked away. He had been only hours old, wrapped in a hospital blanket, his tiny hand gripping her finger with surprising strength. Margaret Wilson stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Your Honor, this boy has spent his entire life wondering why he wasn't enough to keep. He deserves more than watching you walk away again." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood with her back to the courtroom, her hand still on the door handle, caught between escape and confrontation. Behind her, she could hear Marcus's ragged breathing, could feel the weight of every eye in the room. Finally, she turned. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady as she addressed the bailiff. "Clear everyone out except Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Wilson." She paused, then added, "And contact Judge Reynolds to take over my afternoon docket." As the reluctant spectators were ushered out, Sarah finally allowed herself to really look at Marcus. His eyes, her eyes, stared back at her, full of questions she wasn't sure she could answer, full of pain she had caused. The photograph in his hand trembled slightly, a tangible bridge between past and present, between the scared teenager she had been and the successful judge she had become. The door closed behind the last observer, leaving Sarah alone with her son, her past, and the weight of 20 years of choices she could no longer escape. The judge's chambers felt smaller than usual, the walls seeming to close in around Sarah as she stood by her mahogany desk. The familiar space, usually her sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Through the thick wooden door, she could still hear the muffled sounds of the courthouse, life continuing as if her world hadn't just imploded. Her hands shook as she reached for the crystal decanter of water on her credenza, a gift from her colleagues when she was appointed to the bench. The irony wasn't lost on her, celebrated for her judgment while hiding such a monumental secret. Water sloshed over the rim of the glass as she poured, droplets darkening the sleeve of her black robe. "Your Honor?" David, her clerk, knocked softly before entering. His usually cheerful face was drawn with concern. "Channel 6 News is in the lobby. They're saying they won't leave without a statement, and Judge Reynolds can take your cases, but he's asking what he should tell people." Sarah set the glass down without drinking, leaving wet fingerprints on its surface. "Tell them I'm indisposed. Family emergency." She almost laughed at the words. Family emergency. After 20 years of having no family beyond her distant parents in Boston, suddenly she had a son in trouble with the law, a son who had just exposed her deepest secret to a roomful of people. There's something else, David hesitated, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Mrs. Wilson, the social worker. She's asking to speak with you privately before you talk to Marcus. She says it's important. The mention of Margaret Wilson sent another wave of anxiety through Sarah. The social worker had witnessed her shame not once but twice now, first as a terrified teenager, and now as a disgraced judge. Send her in, Sarah said finally, sinking into her leather chair. But David? Not a word of this to anyone. Not yet. David nodded and disappeared, replaced moments later by Margaret Wilson. The older woman closed the door behind her softly, her leather notebook still clutched to her chest like a shield. The years had turned her hair silver, but her eyes held the same compassionate wisdom Sarah remembered from that rainy day at New Hope Women's Clinic. You haven't changed as much as you think, Sarah, Margaret said softly, using her first name with a familiarity that made Sarah flinch. I recognized you the moment I saw you on the bench. You still have that same look in your eyes when you're scared, like you're searching for an escape route. Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. Why didn't you say something? When you realized who I was? When you saw my name assigned to this case? Margaret settled into one of the chairs facing the desk, setting her notebook aside. Because it wasn't my secret to tell. It never was. But I've watched Marcus grow up, Sarah. I've seen him bounce from home to home, always searching for something he couldn't name. He's a good kid, smart, resilient. But he's hurt. Deeply hurt. I thought... Sarah's voice caught. She swallowed hard and tried again. I thought he would be adopted. You promised me he would find a good home. Life doesn't always follow our plans, Margaret replied gently. Marcus had some challenges. Night terrors as a toddler, anger issues in elementary school. Potential adoptive parents would get scared, back out. But do you know what never changed? His determination to find you. Sarah stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, autumn leaves skittered across the courthouse steps where news vans were already gathering. I can't do this, she whispered. My career, my reputation, everything I've built. Is that really what you're worried about? Margaret's voice took on an edge of steel. Or are you more afraid of facing the pain you've been running from for 20 years? Sarah spun around, anger flaring. You have no right to judge me. I was 18, scared, alone. And now there's a 15-year-old boy out there who's been scared and alone his whole life, Margaret cut in. He's not asking for your excuses, Sarah. He's asking for the truth. He deserves at least that much. The words hung in the air between them. Sarah's anger deflated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She sank back into her chair, suddenly looking every bit her 45 years. The truth, she repeated hollowly. The truth is I've spent 20 years trying to pretend that day never happened. I threw myself into my studies, into my career. I sentenced other people's children while trying to forget I had one of my own. Margaret leaned forward, her voice softening. It's not too late to make this right. Marcus has the next hour free before he needs to return to the group home. Talk to him. Not as Judge Mitchell, but as Sarah. As his mother. A sharp knock interrupted them. David's voice came through the door, tense with urgency. Your Honor? Marcus is asking if you're ready to see him. And the press. They're starting to interview people leaving the courthouse. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed life continuing to crumble. When she opened them again, there was a new resolve in her gaze. Send him in, she called out, then turned to Margaret. Will you stay? Margaret stood, gathering her notebook. No, Sarah, this conversation needs to be between you and your son, but I'll be right outside if either of you needs me. She paused at the door, looking back. Remember, he's not just looking for answers. He's looking for his mother. As Margaret left, Sarah heard footsteps approaching. Lighter, younger footsteps. She straightened in her chair, fighting the urge to flee. The door handle turned, and Sarah held her breath, preparing to face the son she had spent 20 years trying to forget. Marcus entered the chambers slowly, the worn photograph still clutched in his hand. In the more intimate setting of her office, Sarah could see details she had missed in the courtroom. The small scar above his eyebrow, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, as if carrying an invisible weight, the slight tremor in his hands that matched her own. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 20 years of unspoken words. Sarah's eyes kept returning to the photograph in his hand. It was like looking through a window into her past. A past she had locked away so thoroughly she sometimes convinced herself it had happened to someone else. "That photo," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you find it?" Marcus moved closer to her desk but remained standing. "In my file at the group home. Mrs. Wilson didn't know it was there. I found it last month when I was helping organize the office during detention." He paused, his free hand touching the small scar above his eyebrow. "I got this scar when I was 6. Fell off the monkey bars at Franklin Elementary. Were you there that day? Did you ever watch me?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had. There had been times, in the early years, when the pain and curiosity became too much to bear. She would park her car across from his elementary school, watching from a distance as children poured out at the end of the day. She remembered that particular day, seeing him fall, fighting every instinct not to run to him as a teacher helped him up. I did," she admitted, the words feeling like they were being torn from her throat. "Sometimes, in the beginning. But it became too hard." She opened her desk drawer, hands shaking as she removed a small leather-bound journal. "I kept track your first day of kindergarten, the time you won the spelling bee in 3rd grade, the middle school basketball championship." Marcus's eyes widened, his composure cracking slightly. "You were there?" "All those times?" "Not always in person," Sarah said, opening the journal. "Sometimes I would read about it in the school newsletter. Sometimes Mrs. Wilson. She would drop hints about your achievements when our paths crossed professionally." She pulled out a newspaper clipping, a grainy photo of a basketball team, Marcus grinning in the front row. "I told myself I was protecting you, that watching from a distance was better than disrupting your life." "Protecting me?" Marcus's voice rose, anger seeping through. "I spent every birthday wondering if this would be the year you'd come back. Every Mother's Day I made cards that never got sent. When I was 10, I ran away from my foster home because I convinced myself you were looking for me and just couldn't find me." Tears spilled down his cheeks now. "Do you know where they found me?" "Outside the courthouse. I'd seen your name in the newspaper and I thought. Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the journal. That day, she remembered that day. A police officer had brought in a lost boy, but she had been in court, too busy maintaining her precious reputation to realize how close he had been. "Your father," she started, then corrected herself. "Your biological father. He was in law school when I met him. He had dreams, plans. When I told him about the pregnancy, he said he'd support whatever decision I made, but his support meant letting you go, giving you up for adoption. He's a federal judge now, in Boston." "Is that why you became a judge?" Marcus asked, his voice smaller now. "To be like him?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I became a judge because I thought if I could help other children, make the right decisions from the bench, somehow it would make up for what I did to you." She stood, moving around her desk but stopping short of reaching for him. "I was wrong. Nothing makes up for abandoning your child." The photograph trembled in Marcus's hand. "Did you ever hold me? Even once?" The question broke something in Sarah. Memories she had suppressed for 2 decades came flooding back. The weight of him in her arms, his tiny fingers gripping her hospital gown, the way his newborn eyes seemed to look straight into her soul. "For 6 hours," she whispered, tears flowing freely now. "They let me hold you for 6 hours. You wouldn't stop crying unless I sang, 'You are my sunshine.' The nurses said they'd never seen such a strong bond form so quickly." Her voice broke. "When they took you away, I felt like they were tearing out part of my soul." Marcus's hand tightened on the photograph, crumpling it slightly. Then why didn't you fight for me? Why didn't you come back? Because I was a coward, Sarah admitted, the truth finally breaking free after 20 years. Because my parents threatened to cut me off to tell everyone about my shame. Because I convinced myself you'd have a better life without me. Because every year that passed made it harder to face what I'd done. She took a shaky breath. But not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about you. Haven't wondered if I made the biggest mistake of my life. Marcus looked down at the crumpled photograph, then back at Sarah. I have one more question, he said, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. That shoplifting charge. Do you want to know why I really took those headphones? Sarah realized with sudden clarity that she did. More than anything, she wanted to understand what had brought her son back into her life after all these years. She nodded, unable to speak. Because I found out you were going to be the judge, he said softly, and I knew it was my only chance to finally meet you. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Sarah gripped the edge of her desk, her judicial composure completely shattered. Marcus had deliberately gotten himself arrested, risked his future, just to force this confrontation. Before she could respond, a gentle knock interrupted the moment. Margaret Wilson entered without waiting for permission, her experienced eyes taking in the scene, the tears on both their faces, the crumpled photograph, the open journal on the desk. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, closing the door behind her, but there's something you both need to know. She pulled out her leather notebook, worn smooth by years of use. Marcus isn't the only one who's been keeping records. Sarah sank back into her chair, while Marcus remained standing, his arms wrapped around himself as if for protection. Margaret took a seat between them, creating a triangle of shared space in the chamber's heavy atmosphere. Sarah, Margaret began, her voice gentle but firm. Do you remember what you said to me the day you signed the adoption papers? You made me promise something. Sarah's hand went to her throat, touching a spot where a small golden locket used to hang. I made you promise to make sure he was safe. Happy. Her voice cracked on the last word. Margaret nodded, opening her notebook. And I kept that promise. Every month for 15 years, I've documented Marcus's life. Not just the basics, where he lived, how he was doing in school, but the little things. The things a mother would want to know. She turned to Marcus. And do you remember what you asked me when you were 7, after your third foster placement didn't work out? Marcus shifted his weight, his eyes downcast. I asked if my real mom ever asked about me. Yes, Margaret confirmed, turning pages in her notebook. And I told you the truth, that she hadn't contacted me directly, but I didn't tell you everything. She looked at Sarah. I didn't tell him about the times I'd see you at children's court events, how your eyes would scan every group of kids looking for him. I didn't tell him about the anonymous donations that would arrive at the group home every year on his birthday, always with a yellow sunshine card. Sarah's breath caught. The cards. She thought no one had made the connection. How did you know? Because I was there the day you sang "You Are My Sunshine" to him in the hospital, Margaret said softly. Some things you don't forget. She turned to another page. Marcus, did you ever wonder why you kept getting placed in schools in this district, even when your foster homes were further away? Marcus looked up sharply. That was you? Margaret shook her head. That was Judge Mitchell. She made sure you stayed in schools where she could keep track of you. She used her influence quietly, always through intermediaries, never directly enough to raise questions. Sarah stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, the media crews had grown, their cameras pointed at the courthouse steps like accusatory fingers. I had no right, she whispered. No right to interfere while still keeping my distance. Maybe not, Margaret agreed. But it shows something important. She waited until Sarah turned back to face them. It shows that neither of you ever truly let go of the other. She opened her notebook wider, revealing pages of carefully preserved memories. Marcus, did you know your mother was there the day you won the science fair in 4th grade? she sat in the back of the auditorium, or that she attended every one of your basketball games last season, always leaving before the crowds. Marcus's eyes filled with fresh tears. Why didn't you tell me? Because it wasn't my story to tell, Margaret replied. But I kept track. Every time your paths crossed, every silent connection, every missed opportunity. Because I knew this day would come eventually. You're both too much alike, too stubborn, too determined to let this go forever. She stood, placing her notebook on the desk between them. 20 years ago, I watched a terrified teenager make an impossible choice. For 15 years, I've watched a young boy carry the weight of that choice. And for all that time, I've watched you both orbit each other like planets that couldn't break free of each other's gravity. Sarah moved closer, her hand hovering over the notebook. All this time, you were building a bridge. No, Margaret corrected gently. I was documenting the bridge that already existed between you. Every decision you made that kept you in his life, even at a distance. Every time Marcus achieved something remarkable, partly hoping it would make you proud enough to come back. She looked between them. The bridge was always there. You just needed help seeing it. Marcus picked up the notebook with trembling hands. Can I read it? Margaret nodded. It's yours. Both of yours. Every memory, every connection, every moment that brought you to this one. She moved toward the door. Take your time with it. Some stories need to be read together. As she reached for the door handle, she turned back one last time. Sarah, do you remember what else you said to me that day at the clinic? You said, if he ever finds me, I won't have the right to know him. But you were wrong. The right to know each other, that's not something that's given or taken away. It's something that's claimed by both of you, right here, right now. The door closed softly behind her, leaving mother and son alone with 15 years of documented memories. Sarah moved closer to Marcus, close enough to see the pages he was already turning with careful fingers. Would you? She hesitated, then gathered her courage. Would you like to read it together? Marcus looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time that day, there was something besides pain in his gaze. Yeah, he said softly. I think I would. Sarah and Marcus sat side by side on the leather couch in her chambers, Margaret's notebook open between them. The afternoon light filtering through the windows cast long shadows across the pages, where neat handwriting chronicled the parallel lives they had lived. October 12th, 2010. Marcus read aloud, his finger tracing the words. Subject withdrew from third foster placement. Recurring nightmares continue. Draws pictures of a woman in black robes during art therapy. He paused, glancing at Sarah. I remember those dreams. I kept seeing someone watching me from far away, but I could never reach them. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned to an earlier entry. May 3rd, 2009. Judge Mitchell inquired about subject's academic progress through intermediary, requested copies of report cards be forwarded to her office under seal. She closed her eyes, remembering. I told myself I was just being thorough with cases in my district, but really I just needed to know you were okay. The pages rustled as Marcus flipped forward several years. March 15th, 2015. Subject participated in middle school basketball championships. Notable attendee Judge Mitchell observed from visitors section departed before game end. Subject scored winning basket. He looked up. I remember that game. I thought I saw you in the crowd, but when I looked again after we won, you were gone. I couldn't stay, Sarah whispered, her voice thick with regret. Every time I saw you achieve something amazing, I wanted to run down and hug you, tell you how proud I was. But I'd given up that right. Marcus's finger stopped on another entry. December 24th, 2016. Annual Christmas donation received at group home. Amount, $500. Note requested funds be used for subject's music lessons. He turned to Sarah, surprise in his eyes. The piano lessons? That was you? Sarah nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, she managed. Your father, your biological father. He was a pianist. When Mrs. Wilson mentioned you had musical talent, I wanted you to have the chance to explore that. I still play, Marcus said softly. It helped when things got hard, when foster families sent me back, or when kids at school asked about my real parents. His hands clenched in his lap. I used to imagine you could hear me playing somewhere, that maybe the music would lead you back to me. Sarah reached for his hand, then stopped herself, uncertain if the gesture would be welcome. But Marcus surprised her by grabbing her hand, holding it tight. His palm was warm against hers, and she could feel his pulse racing to match her own. I don't understand, he said, his voice cracking. If you cared enough to do all this, the donations, the school arrangements, everything, why didn't you ever just come talk to me? Why watch from a distance when I needed you up close? Sarah's free hand traced over an entry from 2018. Subject expressed anger during therapy session. Questions why birth mother maintains proximity without contact. The words blurred through her tears. Because I was a coward, she admitted. Because every year that passed made it harder to face what I'd done. I told myself you were better off without the complications I would bring to your life. That watching over you from afar was the best compromise. She squeezed his hand. I was wrong. So wrong. Marcus turned to another page, more recent. January 15th, 2025. Subject discovered photograph in archived files. Exhibited strong emotional response. Requested information about Judge Mitchell's court schedule. He looked up at Sarah. Mrs. Wilson knew what I was planning, didn't she? When I took those headphones? Sarah studied his face, so much like her own, yet shaped by experiences she should have shared but didn't. She knew you needed to find your way to me even if it meant breaking the law. She straightened, judge-like for a moment. Though I hope you understand that shoplifting isn't the answer to emotional pain. To her surprise, Marcus laughed, a small, wet sound but genuine. Are you really going to lecture me about proper behavior right now? Sarah felt a smile tug at her own lips, the first one since this morning when her world had turned upside down. Force of habit, I suppose. Her smile faded as she turned to the notebook's final entry, dated today. Confrontation imminent. Both subjects have carried weight of separation for 20 years. Healing possible if truth is embraced. Mrs. Wilson, Marcus said softly. She never gave up on either of us, did she? No, Sarah replied, looking at the leather-bound volume that contained so many pieces of their shared story. She kept believing we'd find our way back to each other even when we couldn't believe it ourselves. A knock at the door interrupted them. David's voice came through. Your Honor? The press is getting insistent. And your parents are on the phone. They've seen the news. Sarah felt Marcus stiffen beside her, his hand starting to pull away. But she held on tight, her decision already made. Tell them I'll call back later, she called out. I'm in the middle of something important with my son. The word "son" hung in the air between them, precious and terrifying in its implications. Marcus's hand relaxed in hers, and together they turned back to the pages that held their past, ready to begin writing their future. David's words about Sarah's parents lingered in the air, stirring memories that Sarah had tried to suppress for 2 decades. She released Marcus's hand and stood, moving to a small cabinet in the corner of her chambers. With slightly trembling fingers, she unlocked it and withdrew a dusty manila envelope. There's something else you should see, she said, returning to the couch. Something I've kept hidden even from Mrs. Wilson. She opened the envelope carefully, as if handling evidence in a crucial case. These are letters I wrote to you, one every year on your birthday. I never sent them, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy them either. Marcus watched as she withdrew a stack of letters, each one dated and sealed. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the ink remained clear, preserving words written by a younger Sarah to the son she couldn't reach. My parents, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. They were pillars of Boston society. My father was chief of surgery at Massachusetts General, my mother on the board of every charitable organization that mattered. When I told them I was pregnant, their first concern was the scandal it would cause. She selected a letter from the stack, opening it carefully. "Dear Marcus," she read, her voice catching. "Today you turned one. I wonder if you're walking yet, if you're saying your first words. Mom and Dad threw a fundraiser tonight for the hospital wing they're building. During dinner, someone asked if I ever planned to have children. I excused myself and cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes. Marcus reached for another letter, his hands shaking slightly. Sarah nodded, giving him permission to read. "Dear Marcus," he began. "You're 5 today. I drove past your school again. You were wearing a red backpack and laughing with another boy on the playground. I wanted to stop, to run to you, to explain everything. But Mom called right then, reminding me about the judicial nomination dinner tonight. She said, 'Sarah, dear, aren't you glad you made the right choice back then? If only she knew what that choice cost me.' Sarah stood again, pacing the length of her chambers. They had my whole life planned out. The right schools, the right career, the right marriage. Though that never happened. Having a child at 18 didn't fit their narrative. They gave me 2 choices: give you up for adoption or lose everything. Their support, my college tuition, my future. But you became successful anyway," Marcus said, still holding the letter. "You became a judge without them." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Yes, I did. And do you know what they said when I was appointed to the bench? 'See, Sarah, everything worked out for the best. As if your existence was just an obstacle I had overcome.'" She turned to face him. "But you were never an obstacle, Marcus. You were the best thing I ever did, and giving you up was the worst mistake I ever made." Marcus picked up another letter, dated just 2 years ago. "Why did you keep writing these if you never planned to send them?" "Because I needed you to know me," Sarah replied softly. "Even if you never read them, I needed there to be a record of who I really was. Not Judge Mitchell, not the perfect daughter, but your mother. A scared teenager who loved her baby so much it hurt, who thought she was doing the right thing by letting you go." She sat back down beside him, taking another letter from the stack. "This one I wrote the day you won that science fair. Dear Marcus, I sat in the back and watched you explain your project about sound waves. You were so confident, so brilliant. A woman next to me said you'd probably grow up to be a scientist. I wanted to tell her, 'That's my son.' Instead, I left before the awards ceremony. I'm sorry I always leave. I'm sorry I'm not brave enough to stay." Marcus's fingers traced over the words on the letter in his hands. "All these years I thought you didn't want me, that I wasn't good enough to keep." "No," Sarah said firmly, taking his hands in hers. "You were too good for me, too precious. I convinced myself you deserved better than a teenage mother who couldn't stand up to her parents. But I was wrong. You deserved a mother who would fight for you, who would choose you over everything else." A soft knock interrupted them, and Margaret Wilson entered quietly. "I'm sorry, but Marcus needs to return to the group home soon. It's almost dinner time." Sarah stood quickly. "No, he doesn't. I won't let him go back there." She turned to Marcus. If you're willing to give me a chance, I'd like to apply for custody. I know it's too late for adoption, but maybe—" "It's not that simple," Margaret interjected gently. "There are procedures, evaluations. Given your position and the public nature of this revelation, there will be scrutiny." "I don't care," Sarah said firmly. "I've spent 20 years caring about what other people think, about maintaining appearances. No more." She looked at Marcus. "If you want this, if you're willing to try, I'll fight for you this time. The way I should have fought for you back then." Marcus stood, still holding one of the letters. Can I keep these?" "They're yours," Sarah said softly. "They've always been yours. Everything I am, everything I've done, it's all been yours. I just didn't have the courage to tell you until now." The sun was setting outside her chamber's window, casting long shadows across the floor. In the distance, they could still hear the murmur of reporters and cameras, the world waiting to pass judgment on their story. But in this moment, surrounded by 20 years of unread letters and unspoken love. None of that seemed to matter. The letters lay scattered across Sarah's desk like fallen leaves, each one a piece of the story they were finally sharing. Marcus held the most recent one, dated just last month, his fingers tracing over the words as if they might disappear. "You wrote about my basketball games," he said softly. "About how you'd sit in the back row, leaving before anyone could recognize you. About how proud you were when I made team captain." He looked up at her. "How did you know I made captain?" "It wasn't in the school paper." Sarah moved to her computer, typing briefly before turning the screen toward him. "I have a folder," she admitted. "Every article, every social media post, every school newsletter that mentioned you. I made a Google alert for your name." She laughed softly, the sound tinged with embarrassment. "I told myself it was just professional interest in a minor in my jurisdiction. But really, I was just hungry for any information about you." Marcus leaned forward to look at the screen, his eyes widening as he saw the dozens of saved articles and photos. "You even have my middle school talent show video? The one where I played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata?" "You were amazing," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I watched it so many times I memorized every note. When you hit that final movement..." She stopped, composing herself. "I could see your father in you then. He used to play that same piece." A knock at the door interrupted them. David entered, looking apologetic. "Your Honor, I'm sorry, but the media situation is getting out of hand. Channel 12 is running a story about judicial impropriety, suggesting your oversight of juvenile cases might be compromised by this revelation." Sarah felt her professional instincts kick in, the urge to protect her reputation rising automatically. But then she looked at Marcus, saw the fear creeping back into his eyes, fear that she would choose her career over him again, and something inside her shifted. "Let them run their story," she said firmly. "I'm not hiding anymore." She turned to Marcus. "I've spent 20 years making decisions from the bench, telling other people how to handle their family problems. It's time I faced my own." Marcus stood, moving to the window where camera flashes occasionally lit up the gathering dusk. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice small but steady. "To your career?" "To me?" Sarah joined him at the window, standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his shoulder. "Professionally, I'll probably have to recuse myself from juvenile cases for a while. There will be ethics investigations, reviews of my past decisions." She took a deep breath. "But personally, if you're willing, I'd like to start being your mother. Really being your mother, not just watching from a distance." "It's not that simple," Marcus said, echoing Margaret's earlier warning. "I have issues, trust issues, anger management problems. The last foster family sent me back because I broke a window during an argument." Sarah turned to face him fully. "Tell me about it. Tell me what happened." Marcus wrapped his arms around himself, a defensive gesture she'd seen countless times from troubled teens in her courtroom. It was stupid. They had this family game night tradition, board games, popcorn, everyone together. One night the mom, Mrs. Parker, she hugged her daughter after she won at Monopoly. Just a normal mom thing, you know? But I couldn't handle it. I ran to my room, started throwing things. The window broke. "Because it reminded you of what you didn't have," Sarah finished softly. "Because every happy family moment felt like a reminder of what you'd lost." Marcus nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. "They said I was too unstable, too much work. That's what they all say eventually." Sarah reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement, giving him time to pull away. When he didn't, she gently wiped a tear from his cheek. "I'm not going anywhere this time, no matter how many windows you break." "You can't promise that," he said, but he leaned slightly into her touch. "Actually, I can." She moved to her desk, pulling out a legal pad. "I'm going to write it down, make it official, a contract between us." She began writing in her precise judicial hand. I, Sarah Mitchell, hereby commit to the following. To be present, not just watching from afar, to face whatever challenges come, together to choose you every time, no matter what, to make up for 20 years of missed moments to love you unconditionally, as I should have from the start. She signed it with her full name and judicial title, then handed him the pen. Your turn. What do you want to add? Marcus took the pen, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote, I, Marcus Thompson, agree to. Try to trust again, even when it's hard, share my anger, instead of breaking things, give you a chance to be my mom. Keep playing piano, maybe, eventually. Call you Mom instead of Judge Mitchell. As he finished writing, a camera flash from outside lit up the room, reminding them of the world waiting beyond these walls. But for the first time, neither of them flinched from the light. They had spent too long hiding in shadows. Ready to face them? Sarah asked, nodding toward the windows. Marcus looked at their contract, then back at her. Together? Together, she confirmed, reaching for his hand. No more watching from a distance. The decision to face the media together was one thing. Actually, doing it was another. Sarah stood at her chamber doors, her hand on the handle, suddenly aware of how unprepared she was for this moment. She had faced reporters before, had given countless interviews about high-profile cases. But this was different. This was personal. Wait, Marcus said, touching her arm. Before we go out there, I need to know something. He pulled the worn photograph from his pocket, the one that had started everything. That day, at the clinic, were you alone? Sarah's hand dropped from the door handle as the memory washed over her. No, she said softly. Your grandmother, my mother, was there. She handled everything, made all the arrangements. She said it would be easier if I just let her take care of it. Her voice grew bitter. She even picked out what I would wear, said I needed to look appropriate for giving up my child. The woman in the picture with you, Marcus said, pointing to a barely visible figure in the background. That's Mrs. Wilson, isn't it? Sarah nodded, moving back to her desk and sinking into her chair. She tried to stop it, you know. Told my mother I should have more time to think about it, that there were other options. But Mother... She closed her eyes, remembering. Mother said she'd have Mrs. Wilson fired if she interfered. But she stayed anyway, Marcus said. She kept watching over both of us. Because she saw what I couldn't back then, that some bonds can't be broken, even by signed papers and legal proceedings. Sarah opened her eyes, meeting her son's gaze. She believed in us even when we didn't believe in ourselves. A soft knock preceded Margaret's return. She entered carrying a thick file folder, her expression both concerned and determined. If you're really going to do this, face the media, fight for custody. There are things you both need to know. She laid the folder on Sarah's desk, opening it to reveal documents, reports, and photographs spanning 20 years. Marcus, your recent shoplifting charge isn't your only interaction with the law. There were the fights at school, the running away attempts, the incident with the Parker's window. She looked at Sarah. Are you prepared for how this might look to the ethics board? A judge taking custody of a troubled teen she's been secretly monitoring for years? I don't care, Sarah said firmly, but Margaret held up a hand. You need to care, because the people who'll be investigating this will care. They'll want to know why you never revealed your connection to Marcus in all your years on the bench. They'll question every juvenile case you've ever handled. They'll dig into every decision you've made. Marcus stepped forward, his face pale but determined. I'll tell them it was my fault, that I set this whole thing up with the shoplifting, that she didn't know. No, Sarah interrupted. No more hiding. No more lies. She stood, straightening her robes. I'll tell them the truth, that I was a coward, that I chose my career over my child, that I watched him from afar instead of fighting for him, and that I'm done making that same mistake. Margaret smiled slightly, closing the folder. That's what I needed to hear. She turned to Marcus. And you? Are you ready for what this means? The scrutiny, the questions, the people who'll say you're just doing this for attention or money? Marcus looked at the contract they had written, still lying on Sarah's desk. I spent 15 years wondering who I was, where I came from. Now I know. Whatever happens next, at least it's real. Sarah moved to stand beside him, and this time when she reached for his hand, there was no hesitation from either of them. Mrs. Wilson, she said, we're going to need your help. Your records, your testimony, everything. Margaret nodded, pulling out her ever-present notebook. I've been preparing for this day for 20 years. Every visit, every incident, every time your paths almost crossed, it's all documented, but... She paused, looking between them. Are you sure you want to do this now? We could wait. Let things calm down. No, mother and son said simultaneously, then looked at each other in surprise. No more waiting, Sarah continued. No more perfect timing. We've lost 20 years already. The sound of cameras and reporters grew louder outside the door. David's voice came through. Your Honor? They're saying if you don't make a statement soon, they'll run with what they have. The headlines they're planning. They're not kind. Sarah squared her shoulders, years of judicial authority settling around her like armor. But this time, instead of using it to distance herself from emotions, she let it strengthen her resolve to face them. Marcus, she said softly, whatever happens out there, whatever they say or write about us, know this. I am proud to be your mother. I should have been proud 20 years ago. I should have fought for you then. But I'm fighting for you now. And I won't stop until you're home where you belong. Marcus squeezed her hand, and in that pressure she felt years of longing, of missed moments, of possibilities finally within reach. And I'm proud, he said, his voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. To be your son. Even when I was angry, even when I didn't understand why you gave me up, part of me was always proud that my mother became a judge, that you helped other kids, even if you couldn't help me. Margaret moved to the door, her hand on the handle. Ready? They looked at each other one last time, mother and son, judge and defendant, two pieces of a puzzle finally finding their fit. Ready, they said together. The door opened, and camera flashes exploded in their faces, but this time, neither of them looked away. They had spent too long in the shadows of what might have been. It was time to step into the light of what could be. The courthouse steps had never seemed so daunting. Camera flashes burst like lightning as Sarah and Marcus emerged from the building, their hands still clasped together. Margaret walked slightly ahead of them, creating a buffer between them and the surging crowd of reporters. Judge Mitchell, is it true you've been secretly monitoring this boy's case? Marcus, did you plan the shoplifting to expose the judge? Your Honor, how many other cases have been compromised by personal connections? The questions came rapid fire, overlapping each other in a cacophony of accusation and curiosity. Sarah felt Marcus's hand tighten in hers, his palm sweaty with nervousness. She squeezed back, trying to convey strength she wasn't entirely sure she possessed. I will make one statement, Sarah said, her judicial voice cutting through the chaos. The reporters fell silent, cameras still rolling. 20 years ago, I made a choice that I believed was right at the time. I was young, scared, and more concerned with appearances than truth. Today, that choice came full circle in my courtroom. She paused, looking at Marcus, seeking permission in his eyes before continuing. He nodded slightly, and she went on. Yes, Marcus is my biological son. Yes, I have maintained awareness of his life while keeping my distance, and yes, this will likely impact my position on the bench. But standing here now, I can say without hesitation that no judicial appointment, no professional achievement, could ever be more important than the young man standing beside me. A reporter pushed forward, microphone extended. But Judge Mitchell, isn't this a clear violation of judicial ethics? Having undisclosed connections to defendants in your court? Before Sarah could respond, Marcus stepped forward. His voice shook slightly but grew stronger with each word. She didn't know I would be in her courtroom today. I made sure of that. He swallowed hard, I engineered this meeting because I needed answers. Because every kid deserves to know where they come from, even if that truth is complicated. Another reporter called out, Marcus, are you seeking financial compensation? Is this about claiming inheritance rights? Sarah felt anger surge through her, but Marcus's response was measured, mature beyond his years. This isn't about money. It's about 20 years of missed birthdays, missed holidays, missed moments that we can never get back. But maybe, he glanced at Sarah, maybe we can start making new moments now. Margaret stepped forward then, her presence commanding attention despite her gentle demeanor. As the social worker who has overseen Marcus's case for 15 years, I can verify that both Judge Mitchell and Marcus have acted within legal and ethical boundaries. The judge has never used her position to influence his case management, and Marcus's actions, while unorthodox, were motivated by a fundamental human need to know his origins. The questions continued, but they became background noise as Sarah noticed a familiar figure pushing through the crowd. Her mother, Elizabeth Mitchell, immaculate in a designer suit, her face a mask of controlled fury. Sarah, Elizabeth's voice cut through the chaos like a steel blade. What do you think you're doing? Have you lost your mind? 20 years ago, that voice would have made Sarah shrink into herself, would have made her question every decision. But now, with Marcus's hand in hers, she stood taller. No, Mother. For the first time in 20 years, I'm thinking clearly. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed as she looked at Marcus, taking in his appearance with the same critical gaze that had once made Sarah feel perpetually inadequate. You can't possibly be serious about this. Think about your career, your reputation. That's enough, Sarah interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. You don't get to do this again. You don't get to make me choose between my son and your idea of success. Marcus watched this exchange with wide eyes, seeing his mother stand up to the woman who had orchestrated their separation 2 decades ago. Elizabeth turned her attention to him, her expression softening into something that might have been meant as grandmotherly, but came across as calculating. Marcus, dear, surely you understand that this situation is very complicated. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. Come to some sort of arrangement that benefits everyone. The only arrangement, Marcus said, his voice steady, is that I finally get to know my mother. My real mother, not the version you tried to create. The reporters were eating this up, cameras whirring, microphones thrust forward to catch every word. But for Sarah, the world had narrowed to this moment, this choice. She looked at her mother, seeing for the first time not an imposing authority figure, but a woman whose power existed only if others granted it to her. Mother, she said, you can either be part of this new chapter in our lives, or you can stay in the past where you put us. But either way, Marcus and I are moving forward. Together. Elizabeth's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, Margaret stepped between them. I think that's enough for today. Judge Mitchell and Marcus have a lot to discuss privately. Any further questions can be directed to the court's public relations office. As they made their way through the crowd toward Sarah's car, reporters still calling questions, Marcus leaned close and whispered, Did you mean that? About moving forward together? Sarah stopped, turning to face him fully, not caring about the cameras capturing this moment. Every word. And I promise you, Marcus, no one, not my mother, not the ethics board, not anyone, is going to separate us again. The drive from the courthouse was silent at first, both Sarah and Marcus processing the events that had just transpired. Margaret followed in her own car, leading them not to the group home, but to a small diner on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place Sarah would never have visited in her judicial capacity. Worn leather booths, slightly sticky menus, and the perpetual smell of coffee and grilled onions. I thought we could use some neutral ground, Margaret explained as they settled into a corner booth. And some food. Neither of you has eaten since this morning. Sarah looked at her watch, surprised to find it was already past 6. The day that had started so normally had transformed into something that would change their lives forever. A waitress approached, her name tag reading, Betty, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized Sarah from the local news. "Just coffee for me," Sarah started to say, but Marcus interrupted. "She'll have the cheeseburger and fries," he said, then looked at her uncertainly. "That's what you always ordered when you came to my basketball games. I used to watch you sometimes too." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. All those times she thought she was being so careful, so invisible, and her son had been watching her right back. "You knew I was there?" Marcus nodded, ordering the same meal for himself. "Not every time, but sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of you. You always sat in the same spot, always ordered the same thing from the concession stand. I used to pretend you were just another parent, there to support their kid." Betty retreated with their orders, leaving them in a moment of weighted silence. Margaret pulled out her notebook, but this time she didn't open it. Instead, she placed it on the table between them. "I think it's time we talked about what happens next," she said. "Practically speaking, there are challenges ahead. The group home requires a court order to release Marcus into your custody, Sarah. And given your position—" "I've already called Judge Reynolds," Sarah interrupted. "He's agreed to handle the case, and I've contacted the Judicial Ethics Board. I'm temporarily recusing myself from all juvenile cases pending their review." Marcus looked up sharply. "You're giving up your position because of me?" "No," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm not giving up anything. I'm finally claiming what matters most." She reached across the table, taking his hand. "But you need to understand what you're getting into. Living with me, it won't be easy. The media attention, the scrutiny, my mother's interference." "I've lived in 7 different foster homes," Marcus said quietly. "I've dealt with scrutiny my whole life. At least this time it would be for something real, something that matters." Betty returned with their food, pretending not to notice the emotional intensity at the table. The familiar smell of diner food brought back memories for both of them, all those games where they'd been so close yet so far apart. "There's something else you should know," Sarah said, picking at her fries. "Your father. I called him this afternoon after everything happened in court. He's a federal judge now in Boston. He wants to meet you." Marcus froze, his burger halfway to his mouth. Did he know about me all this time?" "He knew I was pregnant," Sarah explained. "He offered to marry me, actually. But my parents, they said it would ruin both our careers before they even started. They convinced him that giving you up was the only way we'd both achieve our potential." She laughed bitterly. "They were so focused on success, on appearances, they never stopped to consider that maybe being your parents was the most important achievement we could have had." Margaret watched them carefully, her experienced eyes noting every reaction, every nuance. "Marcus, how do you feel about meeting your father?" Marcus set his burger down, thinking carefully before responding. "I want to. Not right away, but eventually. I need to understand where I come from, both sides of my story." He looked at Sarah. "Is that okay?" "Of course it is," she said softly. "You have a right to know your whole history, and Richard, your father, he's a good man. He made the same mistakes I did, letting others dictate his choices, but he wants to make things right too." "Speaking of making things right," Margaret interjected, "we need to discuss school. Marcus has missed significant time due to his moves between foster homes, and with all this publicity—" "I want to stay at my current school," Marcus said quickly. "I finally made the basketball team, and my grades are improving, and—" "We'll make it work," Sarah assured him. "Whatever it takes. I can drive you, or we can arrange transportation. Your education, your stability, those are priorities now." Marcus smiled slightly. "That's what Mrs. Wilson always says, about stability being important." "She's right," Sarah said, looking gratefully at the social worker who had kept faith in both of them for so long. "And speaking of stability," she pulled out her phone, showing them a real estate listing. "My townhouse is too small, just 1 bedroom. But this house, it's halfway between the courthouse and your school. 3 bedrooms, a yard, and—" She scrolled to another photo. "A room that would be perfect for a piano," Marcus's eyes widened. You'd move? Change everything in your life just like that? Nothing about this is just like that, Sarah replied. It's 20 years overdue. And yes, I'll change everything if that's what it takes to be your mother. Not just legally, not just on paper, but in all the ways that matter. 6 months later, the same courthouse steps that had witnessed their public revelation hosted a different kind of gathering. The media presence was smaller now, but still present, as Judge Sarah Mitchell and Marcus Thompson emerged from the building, this time accompanied by Judge Reynolds and a small group of supporters. The adoption papers were officially signed. At 15, Marcus was technically too old for traditional adoption, but the court had approved a permanent guardianship arrangement that would legally bind mother and son until Marcus turned 18, at which point an adult adoption could be processed if they chose. How does it feel? A reporter called out, more respectful now after months of following their story. To finally be official? Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances, sharing a private smile. The past 6 months had been a journey of discovery, challenges, and gradual healing. The house they had moved into, the one with the piano room, had become their sanctuary, its walls slowly filling with photographs marking their new beginning. Official? Marcus replied, his voice confident in a way it hadn't been 6 months ago. We've been official since the moment I stood up in that courtroom. The papers just caught up to what we already knew. Sarah squeezed his hand, remembering the path that had led them here. The first night Marcus had stayed with her had been awkward, both of them walking on eggshells, afraid to disturb the fragile peace between them. But then Marcus had discovered her attempts at cooking dinner, a spectacular failure that ended with them both laughing over takeout pizza on the kitchen floor. The ethics board had conducted their investigation, ultimately clearing Sarah to return to the bench with certain restrictions regarding juvenile cases. Her mother had made several attempts to manage the situation, but each time Sarah had stood firm, choosing her son over her mother's approval. Elizabeth Mitchell had finally retreated to Boston, leaving them to build their relationship without her interference. Marcus's father, Richard, had visited twice. The first meeting had been tense, filled with unspoken accusations and awkward silences. But the second visit had been better, with Richard bringing old photos of himself and Sarah from law school, helping Marcus understand where he came from. They were building a relationship at their own pace on their own terms. Your Honor, another reporter called out, how has this experience changed your approach to juvenile cases? Sarah considered the question carefully. It's taught me that every case that comes before me isn't just about the law. It's about human beings with complex stories. Sometimes the most important judgments aren't the ones we make from the bench, but the ones we make in our hearts. Margaret Wilson stood nearby, her ever-present notebook finally closed. She had been their guide through the legal process, their witness for the guardianship, and their strongest supporter. Now she watched with quiet satisfaction as her 2 decades of faith in them proved justified. The piano recital is at 7, Mom, Marcus reminded Sarah, the word Mom still new enough to bring a smile to both their faces. He had started calling her that 2 months ago, after a particularly difficult night when his nightmares had returned. Sarah had sat with him until dawn, sharing stories of her own fears and regrets, and somewhere in that long night of truth-telling, Judge Mitchell had finally become Mom. I wouldn't miss it, Sarah assured him. Front row just like your basketball games. Only this time, I don't have to pretend I'm not your mother. They made their way down the courthouse steps, passing the spot where they had faced the media storm 6 months ago. The old photograph that had started everything was now framed in their living room, alongside new pictures that told the story of their reunion. Next to it sat Margaret's notebook, given to them as a gift, documenting 20 years of parallel lives that had finally converged. As they reached Sarah's car, Marcus paused. You know what I realized? He said, looking back at the courthouse. That day, when I took those headphones, I thought I was forcing you to face the past. But really, I was giving us both a chance at a future. Sarah pulled him into a hug, no longer hesitant about showing affection. You were braver than I ever was. You fought for what you wanted while I spent years hiding from what I needed most. Margaret approached them one last time, her role as their social worker officially ending with the guardianship approval. The system doesn't always get it right, she said softly, but sometimes, if we keep faith long enough, families find their way back to each other. The evening sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as they drove away, heading home to prepare for Marcus's recital. In the piano room that had once been empty, sheet music for Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata sat ready on the stand. But tonight, Marcus would play a different piece, one he had composed himself, titled simply, Coming Home. The story that had begun with a desperate teenager's choice, that had simmered for 20 years before exploding in a courtroom revelation, had finally found its resolution, not in the dramatic confrontation of that first day, but in the quiet moments they built together, homework help at the kitchen table, weekend basketball practices, late-night conversations about everything and nothing. They had learned that healing doesn't happen in a single moment of truth, but in the 1,000 small moments that follow, in trust rebuilt one day at a time, in love expressed not just in words, but in presence, in the courage to keep trying even when the path forward isn't clear. As they pulled into their driveway, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of possibility, Sarah looked at her son and saw not just who he was, but who they could become together. The judge and the defendant had disappeared, replaced by something far more precious, a mother and son, finding their way home at last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.